Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not just to a specific place, but to a feeling, the heavy, humid air of the Nile Delta, a place thick with the scent of lotus blossoms and political intrigue. Imagine you're standing on the bank of the Nile, the moonlight glinting off the water as a magnificent barge glides silently past. Its sails trimmed with purple and its deck crowded with servants and soldiers. On it sits a woman who, in her time, held the fate of empires in her manicured hands. She's not just a queen, she's a force of nature, a legend in her own right, and you're about to spend the next 45 sections getting to know her. You probably won't survive this deep dive into the sleepy, strange details of her life. But that's okay, because history is much more interesting when it's a little bit dangerous. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the banks of the Nile, and the legend of Cleopatra washes over you like the river's slow, steady current. The first thing you know about her is probably a lie. A beautiful, seductive lie crafted by centuries of art and film. Forget the Hollywood version, the one where she's a statuesque beauty with a flawless profile, because the reality is much more complex and, frankly, more interesting. Her famous charm, the one that captivated two of Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, wasn't just about physical beauty. It was a symphony of intellect, wit, and performance. You find yourself leaning closer, trying to catch a whisper of a secret you can almost feel in the air. A story of a queen who was a master of psychological warfare, her most famous weapon. After her wits was her theatrical flair. This was a woman who understood branding long before it was a corporate buzzword. Think about her first meeting with Caesar. Historians still argue whether she was actually rolled up in a rug or a sack, but the fact that the story even exists speaks volumes. You can picture it. A nervous young woman, a rival to the throne, arriving as a humble piece of luggage to circumvent her brother's guards. But when the rug is unfurled, there she is, not in rags, but in all her royal finery, a dramatic reveal that announces, "I am here and I am in control." It's the kind of move that would have gone viral in 1,000 years, a power play so bold it could only work on someone as confident as Caesar. He probably found it equal parts ridiculous and utterly mesmerizing. This kind of calculated audacity was her signature. She didn't just meet a Roman general, she staged an unforgettable encounter. She understood that men like Caesar, and later Antony, were bored by the everyday and fascinated by the exceptional, so she became an event, not just a person. She spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, which was rare for a Ptolemaic ruler, and she could converse on topics from philosophy to strategy. She was the one who was truly exotic to them, not just another face in a crowd. She was the queen who was also a brilliant conversationalist, a cunning politician, and a devoted mother, not just a pretty face. Of course, the Romans would later twist this narrative, portraying her as a dangerous, decadent temptress who bewitched their great generals with foreign sorcery. That was much easier for them to swallow than the idea that a woman, a foreigner, no less, was a political and military genius in her own right. But you know better. You know that her charm was a tool, a sharp and effective one, wielded with the same precision she used to secure her throne. She used her intelligence as a lure and her royal status as a hook. The more you think about it, the more you realize that the most boring, mainstream historical fact about her, that she was involved with Caesar and Antony, is only the surface of a much weirder, more fascinating story. A story about a queen who used her wit and cunning to keep an entire empire at bay for a little while, at least. You're still there, on the riverbank, the image of that powerful woman lingering in your mind. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of her actual appearance, the one that's been so distorted by the annals of history and, well, Hollywood. The popular image you have of Cleopatra, that of Elizabeth Taylor or Vivian Leigh, is almost certainly a complete fabrication. It's a gorgeous fantasy, sure, but a fantasy nonetheless. In all likelihood, she probably didn't look like a classic Western beauty. This is where a little bit of history gets really nerdy and weird, but also kind of freeing. Historians still argue whether her Macedonian Greek heritage, combined with generations of intermarriage within her own family, resulted in features that were more Greek, more Egyptian, or something entirely unique. The most reliable clues we have are not from biased Roman accounts, but from the coins minted during her reign. When you look closely at these tiny portraits stamped into bronze and silver, you see a striking profile, a prominent, hooked nose, a strong chin, and a brow that juts out with authority. These aren't the soft, delicate features of a movie star, they are the features of a powerful and intimidating ruler. Think less Grecian goddess and more serious, no-nonsense queen. It's a bit like seeing a photo of a celebrity from their youth and realizing they looked totally different before their big break. This was Cleopatra's public face, and it was the face of a pharaoh, not a romantic lead. Now, let's talk about her hair. You probably picture her with a long, dark mane, often braided and decorated, but accounts and depictions suggest she might have worn her hair in the fashionable style of the time, often curled and pinned up. The hairstyles on these coins sometimes show her with a tightly curled bob, a look that would seem a bit out of place with our modern conception of her. It's a little quirky fact that takes away some of the dramatic romance but adds a whole lot of realness. Imagine her, a woman who controlled a vast empire and conversed with the most powerful men in the world, with a hairdo that looks like it could belong to your great-aunt. It's a wonderfully weird piece of the puzzle. Her skin tone is another source of endless debate. Given her Greek ancestry and the North African climate she lived in, it's most probable that she had a Mediterranean complexion, tanned from the Egyptian sun. This stands in stark contrast to the pale, ethereal look often given to her in modern art. She was a woman of the desert, after all, a ruler who would have been exposed to the elements regularly. This mainstream fact, that she was a Greek ruler living in Egypt, is one of the most significant yet often overlooked aspects of her identity. She was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of rulers that was technically Greek, though she, uniquely, embraced the Egyptian culture and traditions. The Roman propagandists, in their efforts to demonize her, didn't need to lie about her looks as much as they needed to twist her story. They focused on her foreignness, her power, and her alleged promiscuity, painting her as a threat to Roman morality and order. The image of the seductive, dark-eyed temptress was born from this political smear campaign, a narrative that was far more useful to them than the truth of a brilliant, if, perhaps, physically unremarkable, queen. The real lie about Cleopatra wasn't her nose or her chin, it was the entire romanticized backstory created by her enemies. And isn't that just like history? The most interesting parts are always the ones that get cleaned up for public consumption. So next time you see a movie about her, with all the glamour and the dramatic lighting, you can smile to yourself, remembering the real Cleopatra. The one with the strong nose and the royal gaze from a tiny metal coin. A woman whose beauty lay not in her face, but in her formidable intellect and unbreakable will. You're still on the riverbank. The echoes of her real image, the strong nose, the determined chin fading into the warm air. Now, let's go back in time, even further than her famous meetings with Caesar and Antony. We need to understand how this young woman, a member of a long and dysfunctional dynasty, came to be the queen who would challenge Rome. Her rise to power wasn't a glamorous coronation, it was a brutal, often deadly, political climb. Cleopatra 7. Thea Philippa was born in 69 BC, a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. Her family tree was a tangle of royal marriages, many of them between siblings, a practice we'll talk about later. This wasn't some quirky family tradition, it was a strategic move to keep the royal bloodline pure and power concentrated. The problem was, it also led to a lot of intense family rivalries. Her father, Ptolemy XII or Letes, was a deeply unpopular and weak ruler, known for his love of music and his reliance on Roman patronage to keep his throne. You can imagine the palace atmosphere, a mix of lavish luxury and a constant, low-level thrum of paranoia. Every meal could be poisoned, every handshake a betrayal. When her father died in 51 BC, Cleopatra was 18 years old. According to Ptolemaic custom, she was to rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was just 10. The arrangement was a sham. Of course, the real power lay with a trio of palace eunuchs and generals who controlled the young king and saw Cleopatra as a threat. Think of it as a corporate takeover where the CEO is a preteen and the board of directors are a bunch of shady, power-hungry sycophants. It's a situation ripe for disaster, and it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Cleopatra, being the far more intelligent and ambitious of the two siblings, was not content to be a puppet queen. She began issuing coins with only her own face on them, a small but defiant act that announced her claim to sole power. This mainstream historical fact is a fascinating glimpse into her early genius. She wasn't just a pretty face, she was a strategic thinker who understood the power of public image, even on something as small as a coin. This move, however, was enough to enrage her brother's powerful advisors, who saw her as a direct threat to their control. The conflict escalated into a civil war. Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria, forced to flee to the eastern part of Egypt and then Syria, where she began to raise an army of her own. This quirky little detail, that the queen was a fugitive, raising a private army, is often glossed over. But it's crucial. It shows a side of her that's less queen in a palace and more determined guerrilla leader. Historians still argue whether she was a truly skilled military commander or just a charismatic leader who could inspire loyalty. But either way, she wasn't the type to sit around and wait for her fate to be decided. Her moment came when the fleeing Roman general Pompey sought refuge in Egypt. The young Ptolemy XIII's advisors, in a colossal blunder, had Pompey assassinated to curry favour with his rival, Julius Caesar. When Caesar arrived, expecting to find Pompey, he was presented with a decapitated head and a political mess. This set the stage for Cleopatra's legendary carpet delivery. She knew Caesar was the key to her power. He was a man who appreciated cunning, and she was about to give him a master class in it. So you see, her famous meeting wasn't a random hookup. It was the culmination of a brutal civil war and a clever political gambit, and she was just getting started. The warm air on the riverbank feels a little heavier now, tinged with the scent of betrayal and ambition. You've seen how Cleopatra's path to the throne was paved with conflict, but let's take a closer look at the most dangerous and intimate battles she fought, those against her own family, her relationships with her siblings, especially her brother Ptolemy XIII and her sister Arsinoe IV, were not the stuff of cozy family reunions. They were a Greek tragedy played out in the opulent, but deadly, halls of a Ptolemaic palace. As we discussed, her reign began as a co-regency with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Remember how he was just a kid? Well, that didn't stop him from being the figurehead for a powerful court faction that wanted Cleopatra out. Their relationship, initially a forced alliance, quickly devolved into open warfare. The civil war that followed wasn't a mere political dispute, it was a family feud on a national scale. You can imagine the tension at the dinner table, if they ever even sat at one. A look could be a declaration of war, a polite word a sign of a double cross. It was a constant, exhausting chess match, and the pieces were human lives. This mainstream fact, the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother, is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It shows that her struggle wasn't just against the Romans, but against her own house. The animosity was so deep that when Caesar arrived, Ptolemy XIII and his advisors were actively trying to prevent Cleopatra from even speaking with him. This is why she had to resort to that famous, clandestine meeting. It was a desperate move to save her life and her throne. Not just a flirtatious stunt, but her sibling rivalries didn't end there. She had a younger sister, Arsinoe IV, who was also a rival for the throne. Arsinoe was a powerful, ambitious woman in her own right, and when the civil war broke out, she took the side of her brother against Cleopatra and Caesar. This quirky detail of a second sister queen-in-waiting is often forgotten, but it adds a whole layer of complexity. Arsinoe even managed to escape Alexandria and was proclaimed queen by her brother's forces. She was a real threat, a genuine contender for the throne. Her determination was a mirror of Cleopatra's, but her allegiances made her an enemy. The story of Arsinoe is a testament to how ruthless the Ptolemaic court could be. After Caesar won the war and restored Cleopatra to the throne, he took Arsinoe as his prisoner and had her marched through the streets of Rome in chains. A powerful symbol of his victory. This was the ultimate humiliation, a public spectacle meant to break her spirit. But here's the really chilling part. Years later, in 41 BC, Cleopatra persuaded Mark Antony to have Arsinoe executed. Historians still argue whether this was a ruthless but necessary political move to eliminate a rival or a simple act of cold-blooded revenge. It's a heavy question, isn't it? To what extent did Cleopatra have to become a killer to survive? Her relationship with her family was a constant balancing act between affection and betrayal, and more often than not, the latter won out. She was not just a queen, she was a survivor in a family of vipers, and her siblings were just as venomous as any of her outside enemies. Their stories, often overshadowed by her larger-than-life drama with the Romans, are a stark reminder of the deadly stakes she was playing for from the very beginning. The air on the banks of the Nile has a new scent now, the musk of Roman ambition. Carried on the breeze from the Mediterranean, you've witnessed the bitter civil war and the vicious family feuds that defined Cleopatra's early reign. Now, let's get to the moment that changed everything. The one we've been alluding to, her first meeting with Julius Caesar. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was a meticulously planned gamble. A high-stakes move that she executed with a brilliant mix of daring and theatricality. After her forces were defeated and she was exiled from Alexandria by her brother's faction, Cleopatra was essentially on the run. You can almost feel the desperation, the frantic energy of a queen in hiding, plotting her next move. She knew that her only hope lay in appealing directly to Julius Caesar, who had arrived in Alexandria to settle the dispute between the royal siblings. The problem, her brother's soldiers were surrounding Caesar's camp, making it impossible for her to simply walk in. She needed to get to him, and she needed to do it without being caught. This is where the famous, almost comical story comes in. A mainstream historical fact is that she was indeed smuggled into the Roman camp, but the exact method is a quirky detail that has been debated for centuries. The most popular version, famously retold by the historian Plutarch, is that she had herself rolled up in a rug, or perhaps a coarse canvas sack, and carried into Caesar's personal quarters. You can just picture it, a burly servant, probably a bit nervous, carrying what looks like a piece of furniture, with the Queen of Egypt tucked inside. It's the kind of thing you'd see in a screwball comedy. Except the stakes were her life and the fate of a kingdom. Historians still argue whether the story is literally true or if it was a dramatic embellishment. Some scholars suggest it was a metaphor for her sneaky entrance, or a legend that grew over time, but the fact that it was told and retold by ancient writers like Plutarch and Cassius Dio speaks to its power. It's a story that perfectly captures Cleopatra's essence, her willingness to do anything, no matter how undignified, to achieve her goal. She didn't just waltz in with an entourage, she made a grand, surprising entrance that announced her cleverness before she even spoke a word. When the rug was unrolled, she didn't just emerge, she appeared in all her royal finery, a spectacle of silk, jewels, and perfumes, a stark contrast to the rough sack she had been carried in. This wasn't just a political meeting, it was a performance. She was selling herself as the legitimate, worthy ruler of Egypt, and she knew she had to make a lasting impression on a man who had seen everything. Caesar, for his part, was reportedly impressed and captivated. He saw in her not just a queen, but a worthy and cunning ally. The chemistry was instantaneous, and it wasn't just physical. It was a meeting of two of the sharpest minds of the ancient world. In that unrolling rug, you see the culmination of her early struggles. She was a fugitive, a schemer, a brilliant manipulator, all wrapped up in a single, audacious act. It's a reminder that great historical events often hinge on the strangest, most unexpected moments. And for Cleopatra, that moment was being delivered to her future lover and protector, not as a queen, but as a piece of cargo. The air on the riverbank is thick with the weight of consequence. You've witnessed the dramatic unrolling of the rug and the powerful first meeting between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. Their alliance, forged in that small room, had far-reaching effects, both political and personal. The most significant and, in many ways, most dangerous of these consequences was the birth of a son, a boy who would be known as Caesarion. This mainstream historical fact, that Cleopatra bore a son to Julius Caesar, is the political dynamite at the heart of their story. This wasn't just another royal child, he was the living, breathing embodiment of the Roman-Egyptian alliance. You can imagine the murmurs and the hushed whispers that must have swept through both the Roman and Egyptian courts. For Cleopatra, he was a massive power play, a legitimate heir to two of the greatest powers of the time. She publicly named him Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, and, more importantly, referred to him as Caesarion, or Little Caesar. This wasn't a casual nickname, it was a defiant statement. For Caesar, the child was a complicated matter. He never officially acknowledged Caesarion as his son in Rome, likely because of the political fallout it would have caused. A Roman law, the Lex Voconica, prohibited a married man from naming a woman or her son as his primary heir, while Caesar was a man who often bent the rules. This was a line he couldn't cross without facing massive public and political backlash. So, while he may have privately acknowledged the boy, in Rome, Caesarion remained a secret, a ghost in the political machine. This open scholarly debate, whether Caesar officially recognized the boy, is a fascinating glimpse into the legal and social constraints of the time. Historians still argue about what his long-term plan for the boy might have been. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit is that Cleopatra had a statue of Caesarion placed next to a statue of herself and Isis in a temple in Alexandria. This wasn't just a proud mother's gesture, it was a divine claim. By associating her son with the goddess Isis and himself with the deified Caesar, she was trying to elevate him to a godlike status. You can almost hear the soft, sleepy cadence of the ASMR narrator describing the cool stone of the statue, the quiet, empty temple, and the audacity of the queen's claim. It's a powerful image of a mother who saw her son not just as her child, but as the living link to her divine and political destiny. The existence of Caesarion also solidified Cleopatra's status in Egypt. With the birth of a son who was half Roman, she could present herself as a bridge between the two worlds, a pharaoh who could speak the language of power in both Alexandria and Rome. But for the Romans, Caesarion was a massive problem. The Roman Senate and the public, already wary of Caesar's dictatorial tendencies, saw the child as a potential threat to the Republic itself. What if Caesar decided to make his son his heir, creating a dynasty and ending the Republic once and for all? These fears would only grow as Caesar's power increased. So, while Caesarion's birth was a moment of triumph for Cleopatra, it was also the beginning of a political time bomb. He represented everything that a large portion of the Roman elite feared, the end of their republic and the rise of a monarchy. And as you'll see in a later section, it was this very fear that would seal the young boy's fate after his parents were gone. He was a symbol of hope and a harbinger of doom, all wrapped up in a child. The Nile's warm air feels a little different now, a little more Roman. You've seen the birth of Caesarion, that political time bomb, and now you find yourself travelling with Cleopatra to the heart of the empire itself, Rome. Her visit to the Roman capital in 46 BC was more than just a diplomatic trip, it was a spectacle, a cultural clash, and a deeply unsettling experience for many of the Roman elite. Cleopatra wasn't just another visiting dignitary, she arrived with a massive entourage and, perhaps most shockingly to the Roman public, with her young son, Caesarion, and her brother husband, Ptolemy XIV. This mainstream historical fact that she spent a significant amount of time in Rome is often overshadowed by her more dramatic encounters. She and her family were housed in Caesar's own villa on the other side of the Tiber, a luxury that must have made a very clear statement about her importance to him. The city was a whirl of activity, and Cleopatra, with her Egyptian customs and Hellenistic style, was a fish out of water. The Romans, known for their conservative values, were both fascinated and appalled by her. They were used to seeing conquered queens in chains, not as honoured guests in the home of their greatest general. You can almost feel the whispers as you walk through the forum. The Roman historian Cassius Dio recorded that she caused a major stir and a scandal among the populace. The more traditional Romans were deeply uncomfortable with Caesar's public devotion to her. This is where a quirky little tidbit comes in. According to some sources, Caesar commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra and had it placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess from whom his family claimed descent. You can almost hear the gasps from the senators as they see a foreign queen's image in one of their sacred temples, right next to a goddess. It was an act of both immense personal adoration and supreme political arrogance on Caesar's part. It was a show of power that went too far for some, a sign that he saw himself as above the conventions and traditions of the Republic. Historians still argue whether this statue was a sign of Caesar's intention to declare Caesarion his heir or simply an incredibly extravagant gesture of love. While in Rome, Cleopatra acted not just as a queen, but as a hostess, holding salons for Roman intellectuals and politicians. She was a master of conversation, and she impressed many with her wit and intellect. She wasn't just a pretty face. She was a brilliant mind who could discuss philosophy and strategy on an equal footing with the Roman elite, but for the average Roman, she remained a symbol of foreign excess and dangerous ambition. They saw her as a threat to their traditional values, a woman who had bewitched their leader and whose presence challenged everything they held dear about their republic. Her time in Rome was a high-wire act. She was an honored guest, but she was also a living, breathing symbol of Caesar's increasing power and disregard for Roman customs. Her stay in the city, which lasted for over 2 years, planted the seeds of the fear and resentment that would eventually lead to the downfall of both her and Caesar. The Roman people loved a victory parade, but they didn't like the idea of their conqueror becoming a king, especially not with a foreign queen by his side. You're standing in the bustling heart of Rome, the air still humming with the whispers and rumors that followed Cleopatra. You've seen the spectacle of her presence in the city, the shockwaves her very existence sent through the Roman elite. But the story of her time in Rome is about to take a sudden, bloody turn that will redefine her life and the fate of the Roman world. The date is March 15th, 44 BC, and the main stage for this next act is the Senate House. The assassination of Julius Caesar is a mainstream historical fact, one that you've probably heard about countless times. But for Cleopatra, it wasn't just a moment of dramatic historical irony. It was a terrifying personal crisis. You can almost feel the chill that must have shot through her. She was a foreign queen, completely reliant on Caesar's protection, and now her patron, her lover, and the father of her son was dead. Assassinated by a group of senators, including his supposed friend, Brutus, who believed they were saving the Republic from a would-be king. For Cleopatra, their actions didn't save the Republic, they plunged her life into immediate danger. Think about her situation. She was in a hostile city, 1,000 miles from her kingdom, with a young son who, for all intents and purposes, was now fatherless in the eyes of the Roman elite, the assassins. Seeing her as a symbol of Caesar's ambition and a threat to their traditional values, would have no reason to protect her. A quirky little tidbit is that at the time of the assassination, Caesar's will was a source of great anxiety for everyone. Would he have named Caesarion his heir? The conspirators held their breath, fearing the answer when the will was finally read. However, it named his grandnephew, Octavian, as his principal heir. This provided a small, brief sigh of relief for the assassins, but it left Cleopatra's future hanging by a thread. The assassination and its aftermath forced her to act quickly. The city was in chaos, and she was an incredibly high-profile and vulnerable target. She had to flee. She had to get herself and her son, Caesarion, out of Rome and back to the relative safety of Egypt. This open, scholarly debate, how long she lingered in Rome after the murder, is a key point of discussion. Historians still argue whether she left immediately, fearing for her life, or if she waited a few weeks to see how the political winds would shift. What is clear, however, is that she made it back to Alexandria with her son, a testament to her swift and decisive action in a moment of extreme peril. The assassination of Caesar was not the end of her story, but a pivotal turning point. It had a domino effect, leading to a new civil war and a new cast of characters in her life. The man who would eventually take up the mantle of Caesar's revenge, Mark Antony, was now on the stage. The Roman elite's actions, meant to preserve their republic, had inadvertently created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum would step Antony, a man who, like Caesar, would be captivated by the queen from the Nile. Her departure from Rome was a desperate retreat, but it was also a strategic maneuver, a quiet promise that she would return to the game of empires, but this time with a new ally. The air on the banks of the Nile has a new energy now. A new player has arrived on the scene. You've seen Cleopatra escape Rome and the chaos that followed Caesar's assassination. Now, let's talk about the man who would take Caesar's place in her life, both politically and romantically, Mark Antony. This is the beginning of one of history's most famous and, Ultimately, tragic love affairs. A story that would reshape the map of the ancient world. Antony was one of Caesar's top generals and a powerful member of the Second Triumvirate, a three-man ruling body that emerged to avenge Caesar's death and restore order. He was a charismatic, seasoned soldier, known for his generosity and his wild parties, but for all his military prowess. He had a fatal flaw. He was easily swayed by personal relationships and a love for the good life. He wasn't a cold, calculating man like Octavian. This mainstream historical fact that Antony was a general who commanded a large portion of the Roman world is the bedrock of his story. He was the most powerful man in the East, and he needed Egypt's immense wealth, particularly its grain supply, to fund his army and his ambitions. Cleopatra, for her part, needed a new Roman patron. The civil war had left her in a precarious position, and she knew she couldn't survive alone. So, in 41 BC, Antony summoned her to Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey, to explain her actions during the recent civil war. He was expecting a humble, perhaps even frightened, queen. What he got was a spectacle. This is where that quirky, fringe tidbit about her theatricality comes in again. Instead of arriving in a simple, diplomatic manner, she staged an event. She sailed up the Cydnus River in a magnificent barge, its sails made of purple silk, its oars of silver. Servants dressed as cupids fanned her, and she was arrayed in the guise of the goddess Venus. The air was thick with the scent of burning perfumes and myrrh. The city's inhabitants, captivated by the show, rushed to the riverbank, leaving Antony alone in the forum. It was a power move, a masterclass in psychological warfare. She was not a subject coming to a general. She was a goddess, a queen, a living legend coming to meet a mortal man. Historians still argue whether Antony was truly smitten from the moment he saw her or if their relationship was initially a cold, calculated political alliance. Was it love at first sight, or a simple quid pro quo? It's a question that gets to the heart of their entire story. What is clear, however, is that Antony, a man who lived for pleasure and spectacle, was completely captivated. He found himself not just with a powerful ally, but with a woman who lived on the same grand scale as his own ambitions. He was the Roman general who thought he had everything. She was the queen who showed him there was so much more. This encounter in Tarsus wasn't just a meeting, it was the start of an epic partnership, one that would lead them to a shared throne and a shared grave. The air on the riverbank feels thick with the scent of myrrh and the quiet grandeur of a staged entrance. You've witnessed Cleopatra's masterful display in Tarsus, her arrival not as a subject, but as a goddess. Now, let's go deeper into that famous meeting and the lavish spectacle she created. This wasn't just about making an impression on Mark Antony, it was a carefully calculated move to establish her power dynamic from the very first moment. The mainstream historical fact is that this meeting was a turning point. Antony, a man accustomed to the gritty realities of war and the rough-and-tumble politics of Rome, was completely unprepared for the level of opulence he was about to witness. Plutarch, the ancient historian, provides a dazzling account that you can almost feel and smell. He describes her barge with its golden stern, the purple sails, and the silver oars that kept rhythm to the music of flutes and lyres. She herself reclined under a canopy spangled with gold, dressed as Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty. Her attendants, dressed as the Nereids, sea nymphs, were positioned on either side of her, while boys, dressed as cupids, fanned her. This was a theatrical production of the highest order, designed to appeal directly to Antony's sensibilities. He was a man who appreciated the finer things in life, a man who had known hardship but now craved luxury. This quirky tidbit, that she didn't just meet him, she put on a full-scale show, highlights her genius for psychological warfare. She was using his own desires and tastes against him, but in a way that felt like a gift. She didn't show up with a petition, she showed up with an invitation to a different, more fabulous world. The entire city was so entranced by the sight that they forgot about Antony, who was left waiting alone in the forum. She was essentially saying, "You think you are the most powerful man in the world, let me show you what real power looks like." By arriving not as a queen from a subjugated land, but as a living goddess. She established a different kind of relationship. She was his equal, perhaps even his superior. And Antony, who had already been softened by a life of military campaigns and political struggles, was completely smitten. Historians still argue whether Antony's infatuation with her was the primary driver for his political decisions afterward. Was it truly a love-struck general? Or was he simply using her immense wealth and strategic location to his advantage? The answer is probably a bit of both. Antony got not just a lover, but the vast resources of Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world. Cleopatra got the protection of the most powerful Roman general in the East and a chance to regain her lost territories and solidify her rule. It was a partnership of immense political consequence, but it was founded on that spectacular, theatrical meeting on the river. The story of the barge on the Cydnus River is more than just a famous scene. It's a perfect microcosm of their relationship, a blend of grand ambition, personal weakness, and an overwhelming desire for a life lived on an epic scale. You can feel the soft breeze rustling the purple sails and hear the soft music of the flutes. This was not a meeting, it was a promise of a life lived not in the mud and blood of battle, but in the opulence and decadence of a truly royal court. You're still on the banks of the Cydnus. The echoes of the flutes and the scent of myrrh still lingering in the air. You've seen how Cleopatra captivated Mark Antony with her lavish display, but their alliance was far more than just a romantic liaison. It was a political partnership of immense consequence, and the most tangible proof of this was the donations of Alexandria. This part of their story is a masterclass in ancient political strategy and a glimpse into a world where a queen could manipulate a Roman general on a truly grand scale. The mainstream historical fact is that in 34 BC, Mark Antony held a public ceremony in Alexandria and made a series of land grants to Cleopatra and her children. This wasn't a small thing. He essentially gave away large chunks of the Roman Empire's territories. You can feel the tension as you picture the scene, a magnificent stage, Antony in the guise of Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, and Cleopatra as Isis, the Egyptian goddess of fertility and motherhood. They sat on golden thrones, surrounded by their children. Antony declared Cleopatra the Queen of Kings and Caesarion the King of Kings. He officially named Caesarion co-ruler with Cleopatra and declared him to be the son of Caesar. The most shocking part, and the quirky detail that would send shivers down the spine of every Roman senator, was what he gave away. He gave territories to each of her children, to Alexander Helios, one of her twins with Antony. He granted Armenia and other lands in the east to his twin sister, Cleopatra Serene. He gave parts of modern-day Libya and Syria, and to their youngest brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, he granted parts of Syria, Cilicia, and Phoenicia. This was not just a show of affection. It was a brazen act of defiance against Rome. It was an attempt to create a new Hellenistic empire under his and Cleopatra's shared rule. With Alexandria as its capital instead of Rome, the Roman public and elite were completely outraged. This was an open, scholarly debate that erupted immediately and still resonates with historians. Was Antony so besotted with Cleopatra that he was willing to give away the hard-won territories of the Roman Republic? Or was he using the donations as a strategic tool to build a power base in the East, one that would allow him to challenge Octavian's authority in the West? The Roman elite, led by Octavian, wasted no time in using this against him. They painted Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman identity for a barbaric foreign queen. The donations of Alexandria became a propaganda weapon, proof that Antony was no longer a loyal Roman but a slave to Cleopatra's ambition and lust. So, while Antony and Cleopatra were standing on that stage in Alexandria, feeling like they had just secured their future, they were actually signing their own death warrant. The donations were a public declaration of their shared power and their ambition to create a new kind of empire, one that the traditional Roman order would never accept. It was a bold move, a beautiful, extravagant, and utterly reckless one. It was the moment they officially took a side in the coming war against Octavian, and it was a decision that there would be no coming back from. The air on the riverbank feels electric with the tension of a looming conflict. You've just witnessed the grand hubris of the donations of Alexandria, a public display that was a clear challenge to Rome. Now, we'll see how Cleopatra was not just a passive figure in this drama, but an active and vital player in the Roman civil war. She wasn't a pawn in Antony's game, she was his most important piece. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra provided Antony with an immense amount of money, ships, and grain to fund his war against Octavian. This wasn't a small donation. Egypt was the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, a breadbasket that supplied much of Rome's grain. Her coffers were full, her navy was powerful, and her granaries were overflowing without her immense resources. Antony's campaign would have been over before it even began. You can imagine the Roman soldiers, grumbling about their pay and supplies, suddenly being fed and equipped with Egyptian gold and grain. It's a powerful picture of a queen who wielded her economic power as a weapon of war. Cleopatra didn't just send supplies, she was also there, in person. She was with Antony during the war, often at his side, and she even commanded a fleet in the naval battle of Actium. This quirky detail of a queen leading her own ships into a Roman civil war is often overlooked, but it is a testament to her dedication and her belief in their shared cause. It's a picture of a woman who was not afraid to get her hands dirty, to be on the front lines, fighting for her kingdom and her family. She was there to fight for her children's future, a future that she hoped would be a new Hellenistic empire ruled by her and Antony. Historians still argue whether her presence was a strategic advantage or a political liability. Some scholars believe that her being there demoralized Antony's Roman troops, who felt they were fighting for a foreign queen rather than for Rome. Others argue that she was a necessary and important part of his command, a brilliant strategist in her own right who provided him with invaluable advice and resources. The fact is, she was at the center of the conflict, a target for Octavian's vicious propaganda and a symbol of everything he claimed was wrong with Antony. Octavian's propaganda machine was relentless. He painted the war not as a civil war between two Roman factions, but as a war between Rome and a dangerous, foreign queen. He claimed that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony and that she intended to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria. This was a lie, but it was a powerful one. It turned the Roman public against Antony and made Cleopatra the villain of the story. In the end, their shared fate was sealed not just by their military defeat, but by the public's fear of a foreign queen ruling Rome. The air on the riverbank feels heavy with the coming storm. You've seen Cleopatra's vital role in funding and supporting Antony's campaign. Now, we'll witness the dramatic climax of their story, the moment where their shared fate was decided, the Battle of Actium. This wasn't just a naval battle, it was the final, devastating confrontation between two of the most powerful people on earth and the ruthless pragmatist who would become Rome's first emperor. Octavian. The mainstream historical fact is that the Battle of Actium, which took place on September 2nd, 31 BC, was a decisive naval engagement. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a massive fleet of over 500 ships, while Octavian's forces, led by the brilliant Admiral Agrippa, had a smaller, but faster and more maneuverable fleet. Antony had positioned his forces in the Gulf of Actium, on the western coast of Greece, hoping to draw Octavian's forces into a naval confrontation. The stage was set for an epic showdown. However, the battle did not go as planned for Antony and Cleopatra. Their large, heavy ships were difficult to maneuver and their crews were not as well trained as Agrippa's. Octavian's ships, with their bronze rams and skilled sailors, were able to outflank and outmaneuver them, causing heavy damage. The battle was a tactical disaster for Antony, but the most debated and quirky detail of the battle is Cleopatra's decision to flee. In the middle of the fighting, she, along with her 60-ship contingent, broke through the Roman lines and sailed away. Antony, seeing her go, immediately abandoned his command and followed her. Historians still argue whether this was a planned strategic retreat or a moment of sheer panic. Some scholars believe that Cleopatra saw the battle was lost and decided to save her fleet and her life, while others argue that Antony's pursuit of her was a cowardly act that sealed their fate. The fact is, their flight was seen as a betrayal by the remaining forces. Antony's army on land, seeing their commander gone, surrendered a few days later. The battle was a complete rout, a total and utter defeat for Antony and Cleopatra. The aftermath was just as significant. The loss at Actium was a mortal blow to their cause. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological one. The battle cemented Octavian's position as the undisputed leader of the Roman world and left Antony and Cleopatra as fugitives. The once glorious empire they had dreamed of was now nothing but a mirage, and their once unassailable power was shattered. Actium was not just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of the end for them. You can almost feel the cold dread as they sailed away from the scene of their defeat, their dreams turning to ashes on the wind. The air on the riverbank feels thick with the bitter taste of defeat. You've seen the total rout at Actium, the moment where Antony and Cleopatra's dreams of a shared empire turned to dust. Now, you find yourself on a ship, a small part of their desperate flight back to Egypt. This wasn't a triumphant return, it was a journey filled with despair and the chilling certainty that their end was near. The mainstream historical fact is that after the Battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria. But this wasn't a simple retreat. They had to sail through the Mediterranean, a sea now controlled by their enemy, Octavian. You can imagine the scene on board her flagship. The Antonia, the silence, the tension, the quiet conversations about what to do next. The once proud queen and the once mighty general were now fugitives, their vast power reduced to a handful of ships and a desperate hope for a miracle that would never come. A quirky detail that highlights their psychological state is the story that, during the journey, Antony sat alone on the bow of his ship for 3 days, refusing to see or speak to Cleopatra. It was a sign of his deep despair and his realization that he had gambled everything and lost. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, was more focused on what to do next. She knew she had to prepare Alexandria for the coming siege, to try and rally her people, to make a final stand. Historians still argue whether Antony's despair was a sign of his weakness or a genuine moment of emotional collapse. Was he a lovesick fool, or a man who had finally broken under the immense pressure? When they finally arrived in Alexandria, they were met not with cheers, but with a palpable sense of dread. The people knew what was coming. Antony, in a desperate attempt to show strength, paraded their children in front of the city, hoping to inspire loyalty, but it was all for naught. Octavian's forces were already on the move, and there was no escape. This flight from Actium was a journey from hope to resignation. They had lost the war, they had lost their power, and they had lost their future. All that was left was the final, tragic act. They were 2 rulers who had once held the fate of the world in their hands, now reduced to huddling in a palace, waiting for their enemy to arrive. The grand romance that had begun with a spectacular display on a river now ended with a silent, somber sail into a city waiting for its inevitable end. The air on the riverbank feels still and heavy, a humid calm before the final storm. You've followed Antony and Cleopatra on their desperate flight back to Alexandria. Now, you're inside the city with them, a silent witness to their final days, holed up in their palace as Octavian's forces close in. This wasn't a time of grand plans or bold strategies. It was a period of slow, inevitable decline, filled with a strange mix of resignation and defiant excess. The mainstream historical fact is that for nearly a year after the Battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra remained in Alexandria, desperately trying to prepare for the inevitable. But it was clear that their cause was lost. Antony's allies in the Roman army were defecting to Octavian, and their navy was in shambles. You can imagine the atmosphere in the royal palace, the quiet despair, the constant sound of nervous servants, and the quiet plotting of their final moves. They knew it was over, but they weren't going down without a show, a quirky, almost unbelievable detail from this period is the formation of a bizarre group called the Inimitable Livers. This was a group of Antony and Cleopatra's close friends who came together to spend their final days in a constant state of debauchery and revelry. They held banquets and feasts every night, as if trying to outrun the coming doom with food and wine. It was a defiant, almost childish, act of hedonism in the face of annihilation. Historians still argue whether this was a true expression of their personalities or a sign of their utter mental and emotional collapse. Were they trying to find joy in their final moments, or were they simply trying to numb themselves to the pain? Their final days were also marked by a strange kind of theatricality. Cleopatra began to experiment with poisons on condemned prisoners, a macabre attempt to find the most painless way to die. She was preparing for the possibility of suicide rather than facing the humiliation of being paraded through Rome. She was not a woman who would be a Roman trophy. She was a queen, and she would die a queen. The final act of the drama began when Octavian's forces arrived at the gates of Alexandria. The city fell quickly, and Antony, in a last, desperate act, tried to rally his remaining troops. It was an epic moment of futility. A man who had once commanded a vast army now reduced to a few loyal followers. The city was overrun, and Antony and Cleopatra retreated to a mausoleum they had been building for their final resting place. This was their last refuge, a tomb that would be their final throne. Their time in the mausoleum was a quiet, somber period. They were no longer the rulers of the world, they were just two people, trapped in a stone tomb, waiting for death. Their story, which began with such spectacle and ambition, was about to end in a quiet, lonely silence. The air on the riverbank feels heavy with the scent of impending tragedy. You've seen Antony and Cleopatra retreat to their mausoleum, a tomb that would serve as their final sanctuary. Now, we'll witness the tragic and almost comically bungled attempt that would precede Antony's actual death, a final, poignant scene that perfectly captures the chaos and desperation of their last moments. The mainstream historical fact is that Antony's death was a clumsy affair. After his final forces were defeated and he was told that Cleopatra had committed suicide, he decided to take his own life. This was the noble Roman way, a final act of honor in the face of defeat. But this is where the story takes a dark and quirky turn. Antony, in a desperate attempt to die a Roman death, thrust his sword into his stomach, but instead of a clean, fatal blow, he botched the job and was left in immense pain, bleeding out on the floor. You can imagine the scene, the hushed horror of his remaining servants as he lay there, mortally wounded but not yet dead. He was in agony, and his attempt at a noble death had become a grotesque farce. But here's the really strange part. As he lay there, he was told that Cleopatra wasn't dead, she was alive, locked away in her mausoleum. He then, in his last moments, begged to be carried to her. This is a moment of pure, gut-wrenching drama. A dying man seeking to be with his lover one last time. Historians still argue whether the news of her suicide was a trick by Cleopatra to get Antony to take his own life. Was she trying to get rid of him so she could negotiate a separate peace with Octavian? Or was it a moment of shared, misguided panic, where both of them thought the other was dead? The fact is, the story of Antony's failed suicide attempt and his desperate crawl to Cleopatra's side is one of the most poignant and debated parts of their final days. He was then, with great difficulty, carried to the mausoleum, but the doors were locked and barred. Cleopatra, fearing for her life, refused to open them. She and her two handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, hauled the dying man up to the window with ropes. It was a bizarre, almost unbelievable, image. The once powerful Roman general, a man who had commanded armies and ruled half the world, now being hoisted into a tomb like a sack of grain. He finally died in her arms. A tragic, painful, and deeply unglamorous end for a man who had lived such a grand and extravagant life. His death, messy and pathetic, was a stark contrast to the noble, theatrical end he had probably envisioned. The air on the riverbank feels heavy with the scent of death and sorrow. You've witnessed the tragic end of Mark Antony, hoisted into a tomb like a sack of grain. Now, you're standing outside that same mausoleum, waiting for the final act of this epic drama, the moment of Cleopatra's supposed death by snakebite. This is the most famous part of her story, but it's also one of the most debated and mysterious. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra died by suicide, but the method is what has captivated and confused historians for 2 millennia. The most popular version, and the one most of us know, is that she used an asp, a venomous snake, to end her life. The story goes that a snake was smuggled to her in a basket of figs, and she either held it to her breast or her arm. This image is so ingrained in our minds that it's almost impossible to separate it from the woman herself. But here's where the quirky tidbit comes in. Many historians and scholars believe the snakebite story is a myth. The asp's venom would have caused a slow, agonizing, and messy death, filled with vomiting and convulsions. This would have been a deeply undignified end for a queen who was obsessed with her image. She had spent her final days experimenting with poisons on prisoners, and she knew that there were faster, more effective, and more painless ways to die. So why would she choose such a gruesome method? Historians still argue whether she used poison, a hairpin, or some other method. The famous snakebite story might have been a later invention, a beautiful and romantic lie meant to make her death more theatrical and poetic. There's also the logistical problem. The snake was an Egyptian cobra, a symbol of royal power, and it was a large, dangerous snake. It would have been difficult to smuggle into a guarded tomb, and a single bite from such a snake would have been a quick but still painful death. The story also claims that her 2 handmaidens died with her, but it's unlikely that one snake would have been able to kill 3 people. This open, scholarly debate, was it a snake or poison, is a testament to how little we actually know about her final moments. The most likely scenario is that she took a quick-acting poison, perhaps one she had tested on her prisoners. This would have given her the dignified, painless death she craved, and it would have allowed her to die on her own terms, without the risk of being captured and paraded through Rome. The snakebite story, however, was much better propaganda. It made her a tragic, mythic figure, a woman who died with a symbol of her royal power, a death as grand and dramatic as her life. The Roman poet Horace even wrote about her death, praising her courage for choosing suicide over humiliation, a final tribute from a poet who had once been on the opposing side. Her final act was a political statement, a refusal to be a Roman trophy. The air on the riverbank feels quiet and still, a moment of silence after the dramatic end of a queen. You've witnessed the mystery of Cleopatra's final moments, but her death was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a powerful political statement, an act of defiance that would echo through history. Her legacy, and how she controlled it in her final moments, is a testament to her intelligence and her unbreakable will. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra's suicide was a refusal to be captured by Octavian. She knew what awaited her in Rome, a humiliating public spectacle, where she would be paraded through the streets in chains as a symbol of Roman conquest. This was the ultimate shame for a defeated foe, and for a queen who had always been obsessed with her image. It was a fate worse than death. She had seen it happen to her own sister, Arsinoe, and she was not going to let it happen to her. Her death, regardless of the method, was a final act of agency, a bold declaration that she would die on her own terms, a queen to the very end. A quirky detail is that Octavian was reportedly both furious and impressed by her suicide. He had wanted her alive to use her as a trophy in his triumph, the grand parade that a victorious Roman general would hold in Rome. He had even tried to prevent her death, but he was too late. He was robbed of his ultimate prize, the living symbol of his victory over a foreign queen who had almost brought Rome to its knees. He was so frustrated that he reportedly had a statue of her, along with the asp, carried in his triumph instead. It was a pale substitute, a symbol for the real thing he had failed to capture. Historians still argue whether Octavian's decision to have a statue of her in his triumph was a sign of grudging respect or a final act of mockery. Was he trying to show the Roman people that he had conquered her, or was he trying to make up for the fact that he hadn't? What is clear, however, is that Cleopatra, in death, had a kind of victory. She had denied her enemy the one thing he truly wanted, her humiliation. She had chosen her own story, her own final chapter, and in doing so, she became a legend. Her final act was a message to the world. It was a message of defiance, of pride, and of an unyielding refusal to be subjugated. She may have lost the war, but she won the peace, at least in the eyes of history. Her story has been told and retold for millennia, a testament to a queen who, even in death, refused to be a footnote in someone else's story. She was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and she went out not with a whimper, but with a bang, a final act of defiance that secured her place in the annals of history forever. The air on the riverbank feels quiet and reflective, a moment to step back from the dramatic end of Cleopatra's life and look at the world she inherited. You've seen her final act of defiance, her refusal to be a Roman trophy. Now, let's go back in time, nearly 300 years before her birth. To understand the dynasty she was born into, this is the story of Ptolemaic Egypt, a Hellenistic kingdom that was both a world power and a deeply dysfunctional family. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ptolemaic dynasty was founded by Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his vast empire was carved up by his generals. Ptolemy, a clever and ambitious man, took control of Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. This wasn't a small-time gig. Egypt was a wealthy and strategic prize, a land of immense resources and an ancient, powerful culture. Ptolemy ruled with an iron fist, but he also embraced the local traditions, portraying himself as a pharaoh in the Egyptian style. This created a quirky little dichotomy that would define the dynasty for centuries. They were Greek rulers living in Egypt, and they never truly integrated into the local culture. They spoke Greek, they worshipped Greek gods, and they maintained a Greek court in the city of Alexandria, a magnificent city founded by Alexander himself. This cultural divide created a constant tension between the Greek rulers and their Egyptian subjects. The Ptolemies were a foreign power, a fact that was often a source of instability. Historians still argue whether the Ptolemies were successful rulers or a dynasty in slow decline from the start. Some scholars point to their immense wealth and power, while others focus on their constant civil wars, assassinations, and incestuous marriages. The Ptolemaic court was a viper's nest of intrigue, where siblings murdered siblings and children conspired against parents. It was a dark and dangerous world, one that Cleopatra would have to navigate from a very young age. Her dynasty was a world of contradictions, Greek in culture but Egyptian in power, a land of immense wealth but constant instability. The Ptolemies ruled a land of ancient wonders, but they were a new and often unpopular foreign power. They were a Greek dynasty that had to convince their Egyptian subjects that they were legitimate pharaohs. This was the world that Cleopatra inherited, a world of immense power and constant peril. She wasn't just a queen, she was a survivor in a dying dynasty, a woman who had to use every ounce of her intelligence and charm to keep her family's crumbling empire afloat. The air on the riverbank feels thick with the complexities of her heritage. You've seen that the Ptolemaic dynasty was Greek, a foreign ruling class in an ancient land. Now, let's talk about a detail that set Cleopatra apart from her ancestors and gave her a unique political advantage: her mastery of languages. This wasn't just a quirky personal skill, it was a powerful tool that allowed her to connect with her people in a way her family never had. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 300 years to learn to speak Egyptian. The rest of her dynasty spoke only Greek, a fact that created a significant divide between them and their subjects. They were rulers who couldn't speak the language of the people they ruled. This is where Cleopatra was different. You can imagine her as a young woman, learning the ancient hieroglyphs and the Demotic script, a skill that would have set her apart from her siblings and her ancestors. This wasn't just a linguistic achievement, it was a political statement. Her ability to speak Egyptian allowed her to communicate directly with her court officials, her priests, and her people. This cut out the need for translators and gave her a direct line of communication with the Egyptian elite. It was a sign of her respect for the local culture, a subtle but powerful way of saying, "I am one of you." Historians still argue whether her embrace of Egyptian culture was a genuine love for the land or a shrewd political move to secure her power. The answer is probably a bit of both. A leader who can speak the language of their people is a leader who can command their loyalty. And Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, understood this perfectly. A quirky detail that highlights her linguistic prowess is that she was said to have been able to speak over a dozen languages, including Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. This was a rare trait for a ruler of her time, and it made her a formidable diplomat. She could speak to Roman officials in their own language, and she could converse with the leaders of her client kingdoms in theirs. She was a woman who could bridge cultural divides with a single word. Imagine the Roman generals, used to dealing with translators, suddenly faced with a queen who could switch from Greek to Latin to Aramaic with effortless grace. It was a skill that would have impressed them, and it was a skill that she used to her full advantage. This linguistic genius was a key part of her charm and her power. It was a personal touch that set her apart from her family and made her a truly unique ruler. She wasn't just a Greek queen in a land of Egyptians, she was a queen who understood her people, and she was a queen who could speak their language. The air on the riverbank feels full of the ghosts of knowledge. You've seen Cleopatra's mastery of languages, a skill that set her apart. Now, let's talk about a different kind of knowledge. One that was central to the world she inhabited but was already in a state of slow decline. the Great Library of Alexandria. This was not just a building full of books, it was a symbol of the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world, and its decline is a story of slow, almost imperceptible loss. The mainstream historical fact is that the Library of Alexandria was the largest and most famous library of the ancient world. It was a repository of all known knowledge, a place where the greatest minds of the ancient world came to study and work. It was a testament to the Ptolemaic dynasty's commitment to scholarship and learning. You can imagine the thousands of scrolls, the hundreds of scholars, and the immense knowledge contained within its walls. But here's the quirky and often misunderstood part of the story. The library's decline wasn't a single, cataclysmic event. It wasn't one great fire that destroyed it all. While a fire did occur during Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BC, and it did destroy some of the scrolls, it was not a total destruction. The library and its sister institution, the Serapeum, continued to exist for centuries. The real story of its decline is a slower, more tragic tale of neglect, political instability, and changing intellectual trends. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events that led to its final destruction. Was it a series of fires, a lack of funding from later rulers, or the rise of Christianity, which saw pagan texts as a threat? The fact is, the library's death was a slow one. It was a gradual fading away, a loss of importance and prestige. It was a symbol of the Ptolemaic dynasty's slow decline, a physical manifestation of a world that was losing its grip on power and influence. By the time of Cleopatra, the library was already a shadow of its former self. It was a place of fading glory, a physical reminder of a golden age that was long gone. The library's slow death is a perfect metaphor for the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty itself. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, painful, and inevitable decline. And, in the end, it was a tragedy for both the dynasty and for all of human knowledge. The air on the riverbank feels sacred and old, full of the ancient traditions that Cleopatra was born into. You've seen the slow, tragic decline of the Great Library. Now, let's talk about a different kind of belief system, one that Cleopatra used to her full political advantage: Egyptian religion. She wasn't just a queen, she was a pharaoh, and that meant she had to be a living, breathing god. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra portrayed herself as a living goddess, the new incarnation of Isis, the goddess of fertility and motherhood. This was a clever and powerful political move. The Ptolemaic dynasty had always been Greek, but they had also adopted the Egyptian tradition of the pharaoh as a divine ruler. You can imagine her in her palace, dressed in the traditional headdress and robes of a pharaoh, a living connection to a tradition that was thousands of years old. She was a ruler who understood that power in Egypt was not just about military might or political cunning, it was about divine right. A quirky detail that highlights her devotion to this image is her famous meeting with Mark Antony in Tarsus. Remember how she dressed as Venus, the Roman goddess? Well, in Alexandria, she was Isis. She used her image as a political tool, a way of speaking to different audiences in their own language. She was Venus for the Romans, a goddess of love and beauty, and she was Isis for the Egyptians, a goddess of power and life. Historians still argue whether her devotion to Isis was genuine or a cynical political ploy. Was she a true believer? Or was she just a clever manipulator? Her association with Isis was a brilliant move. It connected her to a powerful and ancient deity, and it gave her a legitimacy that her ancestors had lacked. Isis was a beloved goddess, and by portraying herself as her living embodiment, Cleopatra was able to command the loyalty and devotion of her Egyptian subjects. It was a way of saying, "I am not just a Greek queen, I am your pharaoh, and I am a goddess." Her use of religion was a testament to her intelligence. She understood that she couldn't simply rely on her Roman allies. She had to build her own power base, and she did that by embracing the very culture her ancestors had ignored. She was the one who could bridge the gap between Greek and Egyptian culture, and she did it by becoming a goddess. The air on the riverbank feels heavy with the weight of her choice. You've seen how Cleopatra used religion and her own image to secure her power. But her suicide, that final act of defiance, had a devastating impact on the people she loved most, her children. This is the sad and often forgotten part of her story. the legacy she left behind. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra had 4 children. There was Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, and the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and her youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, all with Mark Antony. After her death, they became wards of Octavian. They were taken to Rome, not as honoured guests, but as trophies of his victory. You can imagine the journey. A trio of children from a luxurious palace now in the hands of their parents' mortal enemy. Octavian, ever the pragmatist, saw the children as both a symbol of his victory and a potential political problem. His first order of business was to eliminate the greatest threat to his power, Caesarion. He had the young boy murdered, citing the maxim, "It is not good to have too many Caesars." It was a cold, brutal, and utterly logical decision. The child who was the living, breathing link to Caesar had to be eliminated. His death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a quiet and tragic end for a line of rulers that had lasted for 3 centuries. But what about the other children? This is where a quirky and almost heartwarming detail comes in. Octavian, in a rare act of mercy, decided to spare Cleopatra and Antony's children. He gave them to his sister, Octavia, Antony's former wife, to raise as her own. It's a strange and almost unbelievable turn of events. You have the children of a great Roman general and a foreign queen, now being raised by the very woman whose life they had upended. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine act of compassion or a shrewd political move. Was he trying to show the Roman people that he was a merciful ruler, or was he trying to control the children and their potential claim to power? The children's fate was a mix of triumph and tragedy. Cleopatra Selene, the twin sister, went on to marry the king of Mauritania and became a powerful and influential queen in her own right. She ruled her kingdom with a firm hand and was a patron of the arts and sciences. Her brother, Alexander Helios, disappears from the historical record, likely dying at a young age. Their youngest brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, also disappears, his fate unknown. Their lives, a mix of power, privilege, and pain, are a testament to the tragic legacy of their parents' ambition. They were the collateral damage of a war between 2 empires, and their lives were a mix of hope and despair. A quiet end to a very loud story. The air on the riverbank feels full of the lies and half-truths that have been told about her. You've seen the tragic fate of her children, and now we must confront the most enduring lie of all, the myth of Cleopatra's beauty. This myth, which has been perpetuated by artists and filmmakers for centuries, was not a product of her admirers. It was, in fact, the work of her most bitter enemy. The mainstream historical fact is that the myth of Cleopatra as a stunning beauty was largely created by Roman propagandists after her death. Octavian needed to justify his war against her. He couldn't simply say that he had fought a powerful, intelligent, and cunning queen. That would have made him seem ruthless and cruel. So, he painted her as a different kind of enemy, a seductive temptress who had used her feminine wiles to bewitch 2 of Rome's most important men. This was a narrative that the Roman public could understand and accept. She wasn't a brilliant ruler, she was a dangerous siren. A quirky detail that highlights this is how she was portrayed in Roman literature. She was often depicted as a man-eating foreign monster, a woman who used sex and sorcery to enslave her Roman lovers. The Roman poet Horace, for example, referred to her as a fatal monster. This was a far cry from the real woman, who was a master of politics and a brilliant diplomat. The Romans had to turn her into a stereotype, a caricature of a dangerous woman, to make their conquest of her seem justified. Historians still argue whether the Roman elite truly believed this propaganda, or if it was just a tool to manipulate public opinion. The fact is, the myth of her beauty was so powerful that it has lasted for 2 millennia. The myth was a clever piece of political spin. It turned a complex historical event into a simple moral tale. It was a story about a virtuous Rome, led by the noble Octavian, conquering a decadent and dangerous East, led by a seductive and immoral queen. It was a lie, but it was a powerful one, and it's one that we've all been telling ourselves for centuries. The real Cleopatra, the one with the strong nose and the sharp mind, has been lost to us, buried under a mountain of propaganda and myth. The air on the riverbank feels full of sweet, earthy scents, a break from the political intrigue and military defeats. You've just learned about how the myth of Cleopatra's beauty was a Roman creation. Now, let's talk about a more truthful and a much more fascinating part of her world, the role of perfume and cosmetics in ancient Egypt. This wasn't just about making oneself beautiful, it was about hygiene, status, and even spiritual practice. The mainstream historical fact is that ancient Egyptians, both men and women, were obsessed with cleanliness and appearance. They used a wide range of cosmetics and unguents, not just for vanity, but for practical reasons. The desert climate was harsh, and these products were essential for protecting the skin from the sun and sand. You can imagine the heavy, sweet scent of lotions and oils, a mixture of exotic spices and plants, filling the air. This wasn't a world of dry, unwashed bodies. It was a world of ritual bathing and perfumed oils, a place where personal hygiene was a sign of both wealth and piety. A quirky detail that highlights this is the use of crocodile dung as a sunscreen. It's a bizarre and slightly stomach-churning tidbit, but it speaks to the ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians. They used whatever they could find to protect their skin from the brutal sun, and remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. It's a fun callback to the strangeness of ancient life, a reminder that their world was both a lot like ours and completely, utterly different. Historians still argue about the exact recipes for some of these ancient perfumes and cosmetics. The ingredients were often a mix of local and imported plants, spices, and resins. They used kohl, a black powder, to line their eyes, not just to make them look larger, but also to ward off flies and protect their eyes from the glare of the sun. They used malachite, a green mineral, as an eyeshadow, and their perfumes were made from a base of oils, infused with everything from myrrh and frankincense to lotus and cinnamon. Cleopatra, ever the trendsetter, was reportedly a master of perfumery. She was said to have a library of perfume recipes and a workshop where she experimented with different scents. She even wrote a book on cosmetics and beauty, though it has unfortunately been lost to history. This is a testament to her fascination with science and her love for the beautiful things in life. She used these scents and cosmetics not just to make herself look good, but to create an aura of power and divinity. A queen who smelled of exotic spices and flowers was a queen who was not from this world. The air on the riverbank feels full of the salt spray from the sea and the sound of waves crashing against a long-lost shore. You've just learned about the role of cosmetics and perfumes in her world. Now, let's talk about another piece of the Ptolemaic puzzle. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. This wasn't just a beacon, it was a symbol of her city's power, wealth, and its strategic importance as a hub of trade and knowledge. The mainstream historical fact is that the Lighthouse of Alexandria, also known as the Pharos of Alexandria, was a massive tower built to guide sailors into the city's harbour. It was one of the tallest man-made structures of its time, a towering symbol of the city's greatness. You can picture it in your mind, a multi-tiered tower, a massive mirror on top, and a fire that burned brightly day and night, a guiding light for ships from all over the Mediterranean. A quirky detail about the lighthouse is the massive mirror that sat at its apex. According to some accounts, this mirror was so powerful that it could be used to see ships that were hundreds of miles away. It was also rumoured to have been used to focus the sun's rays to burn enemy ships before they even reached the harbour. While this is likely an exaggeration, it speaks to the awe and wonder that the lighthouse inspired in the ancient world. Historians still argue whether the mirror was made of polished bronze or some other material, and whether it was used for anything other than a beacon. The lighthouse was not just a symbol of the Ptolemaic dynasty's engineering prowess, it was also a symbol of their control over the sea lanes of the Mediterranean. Alexandria was a major port, a city where goods from all over the ancient world flowed in and out. The lighthouse was a testament to the city's importance as a centre of commerce and trade. It was a physical manifestation of the Ptolemaic dynasty's power, a shining light in a world of political darkness. It was a beacon of hope and a symbol of wealth. And it was a structure that Cleopatra would have seen every day of her life. The lighthouse, like the great library, was a part of the world that Cleopatra inherited. It was a symbol of a golden age that was slowly fading, a testament to a dynasty that was in a state of slow decline. But it was also a symbol of a city that was still a major player on the world stage, a city that Cleopatra would use as her base of power to challenge Rome itself. The air on the riverbank feels full of the weight of gold and the scent of grain. You've just learned about the Lighthouse of Alexandria, a symbol of the city's commercial power. Now, let's talk about the engine that powered that city and Cleopatra's entire empire, her economic policies. She wasn't just a charming queen, she was a ruthless and brilliant administrator who understood that money was the ultimate source of power. The mainstream historical fact is that Egypt was the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean, a fact due almost entirely to its vast agricultural output. The Nile River, with its annual floods, created a fertile land that could produce enough grain to feed not just Egypt, but a large part of the Roman Empire as well. This gave Cleopatra an immense amount of leverage, a fact that both Caesar and Antony knew very well. She was, in essence, the ruler of the ancient world's breadbasket. A quirky detail that highlights her economic cunning is her use of a state monopoly on certain goods. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a state monopoly on everything from papyrus and beer to olive oil and textiles. This allowed them to control prices, regulate production, and, most importantly, tax their subjects at a very high rate. It was a brilliant, if brutal, system that ensured a constant flow of revenue into the royal coffers. Historians still argue whether her economic policies were a source of stability or a source of resentment among her people. The fact is, she ran her kingdom like a business, and she was very, very good at it. Cleopatra also understood the importance of a strong currency. She revalued the Egyptian currency, the Ptolemaic drachma, to bring it in line with the Roman denarius. This was a smart move that made it easier for her to do business with her Roman allies. She was a ruler who understood the importance of a strong economy, and she used her wealth to fund her ambitions. She paid for Antony's army. She built a magnificent fleet of ships, and she lived a life of unimaginable luxury, all on the backs of her people. Her economic policies were a source of immense power, but they were also a source of immense resentment. She was a ruler who understood that money was the ultimate source of power, and she was not afraid to use it. The air on the riverbank feels full of the sound of Roman jeers and whispered rumors. You've just learned about Cleopatra's immense economic power. Now, let's talk about how the Romans saw her. A perspective that was shaped by fear, propaganda, and a deep-seated distrust of powerful foreign women. She wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol of everything they feared and despised. The mainstream historical fact is that Roman historians and poets portrayed Cleopatra as a seductive, dangerous, and decadent foreign queen. She was the anti-Roman woman, a figure who represented the opposite of the virtues they held dear: modesty, frugality, and loyalty to the Republic. You can almost hear the soft, sleepy cadence of the narrator describing the Roman elite, a group of men who saw her as a threat to their entire way of life. She was a woman who didn't know her place, and they couldn't stand it. A quirky detail that highlights this is how she was depicted in Roman poetry. She was often referred to as a monster, a term that was not just a metaphor for her power, but a literal denunciation of her as something less than human. The Roman poet Virgil, in his epic poem The Aeneid, described her as a woman with a monstrous bark, a reference to the barking of the Egyptian god Anubis. It was a vicious and dehumanizing slur, a sign of how deeply they hated and feared her. Historians still argue whether this was a true reflection of Roman sentiment or a cynical piece of propaganda by Octavian's court. The fact is, the image of Cleopatra as a monster was a powerful tool in the war against her and Antony. The Romans saw her not just as a queen, but as a sorceress, a woman who had used magic and seduction to bewitch a great Roman general. They couldn't accept that a woman, a foreigner no less, was a political and military genius in her own right. It was much easier for them to believe that she had used some kind of dark, Eastern magic to bend Antony to her will. This was a narrative that made sense to them, a way of explaining the unexplainable. In the end, the Roman perspective on her was a mirror of their own insecurities. They were a republic on the verge of becoming an empire, and they feared that the virtues that had made them great were being eroded by the luxuries and decadent foreign influences that people like Cleopatra represented. She wasn't just a woman, she was a symbol of their own decline, and they had to destroy her to save themselves. Her story, from their perspective, was a cautionary tale, a lesson in what happens when you let a foreign queen get too close to power. The air on the riverbank feels thick with the dust of forgotten rivalries. You've just learned how the Romans saw Cleopatra. And now let's talk about a woman who was a rival from the start. Her sister, Arsinoe IV. While the world remembers the dramatic conflict between Cleopatra and her brother, the story of Arsinoe is a compelling and often tragic parallel, a testament to the brutal realities of the Ptolemaic court. The mainstream historical fact is that Arsinoe was Cleopatra's younger sister and a rival for the throne when her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was fighting against Cleopatra and Caesar. Arsinoe left Alexandria and was proclaimed queen by her brother's faction. She was a powerful and ambitious woman in her own right, and she commanded a portion of the army, even leading some of her brother's forces in the war against Caesar. This is a crucial detail, as it shows that Cleopatra wasn't the only one in the family with a lust for power. But here's a quirky detail that adds a layer of complexity to their relationship. The two sisters were never allies, they were rivals from the start. And Arsinoe's decision to side with her brother was not just a political move, it was a personal one. You can almost feel the tension between them. Two ambitious sisters, both vying for the same crown. Their rivalry was a family feud on a grand scale, one that had devastating consequences for both of them. After Caesar defeated Ptolemy XIII, he had Arsinoe captured and taken to Rome. She was paraded through the streets in chains during his triumph, a humiliating public spectacle that was meant to break her spirit. But in a strange twist of fate, the Roman crowd, in a rare display of compassion, was moved by her plight and demanded that she be spared. Caesar, in a moment of political cunning, granted their request and had her exiled to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Historians still argue whether this was a true act of mercy or a politically motivated decision. Was he trying to show the Roman people that he was a merciful ruler, or was he just biding his time? The fact is, Arsinoe remained a threat to Cleopatra's rule. As long as she was alive, there was a potential rival for the throne. And in 41 BC, Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, persuaded Mark Antony to have her killed. Arsinoe was dragged from the temple and executed, a final and brutal end to a woman who had tried to take her sister's throne. Her death was a stark reminder of the deadly stakes of the game they were playing. The air on the riverbank feels full of the cold, quiet stillness of a tomb. You've just witnessed the brutal end of Cleopatra's rival sister, Arsinoe. But the story of Arsinoe doesn't end with her death. The fate of her tomb and the surprising archaeological claims that surround it are a fascinating and quirky mystery, a testament to how history can be lost and then rediscovered in the most unexpected ways. The mainstream historical fact is that Arsinoe was buried in the city of Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, after her assassination. The city was a major hub of the ancient world, and the Temple of Artemis where she took refuge was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But her tomb was lost to history for nearly 2 millennia, a forgotten grave in a forgotten city. Then, in the 1990s, a team of archaeologists, led by Hilke Thür of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, made a stunning discovery. They found an octagonal tomb, a structure that was unique in the region, and inside, they found the remains of a young woman, a fact that was a quirky detail that would send shockwaves through the historical community. The tomb was a high-status burial, a place where a powerful person would have been laid to rest. The woman's skeleton was a crucial piece of evidence. Historians still argue whether the tomb actually belongs to Arsinoe. The evidence is compelling, but not conclusive. The tomb is in the right place, a high-status burial in the city where she was killed. The structure itself, an octagonal shape, is a unique feature that has been linked to the Ptolemaic dynasty. But the woman's skeleton is the most tantalizing clue. Forensic analysis revealed that she was a young woman, a fact that fits with Arsinoe's age at the time of her death, but there are still debates about her race and lineage. Some scholars believe that the skeleton shows traces of African and Egyptian ancestry, which would be a surprising detail for a member of a Macedonian Greek dynasty that had practiced incest for generations. This open scholarly debate is a perfect example of how archaeology can challenge our long-held historical beliefs. The possibility that the tomb and the skeleton belong to Arsinoe is a compelling one. It would mean that we have found the remains of a real historical figure, a woman who was a rival to one of the most famous queens in history. It's a reminder that history isn't just a series of famous names and dates, it's a series of mysteries, a series of secrets waiting to be uncovered. And in the quiet corners of an ancient city, a forgotten rival may have finally found her final resting place. The air on the riverbank feels full of the echoes of a long-dead empire. You've just learned about the mysterious fate of Arsinoe. And now we must go even further back in time. To the man who made it all possible, Alexander the Great. You can't understand Cleopatra's dynasty without understanding its founder, a man who, in a few short years, changed the course of history and created the Hellenistic world that Cleopatra inhabited. The mainstream historical fact is that Alexander the Great, a Macedonian king, conquered the known world in the 4th century BC. His conquests stretched from Greece all the way to India, and he founded cities and kingdoms all over the known world. One of his most important conquests was Egypt, a land he took from the Persians and founded the city of Alexandria. This was not just a military victory, it was the beginning of a new era, the Hellenistic Age, a period of Greek culture, art, and science that would last for centuries. A quirky detail about Alexander's time in Egypt is his visit to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis. According to legend, the oracle confirmed that he was the son of Zeus, the Greek king of the gods, and that he was a divine pharaoh. This was a brilliant piece of political theatre, a way for him to legitimize his rule in the eyes of his new Egyptian subjects. It was a sign that he understood that power in Egypt was not just about military might, it was about divine right. Historians still argue whether Alexander truly believed he was a god, or if he was just a shrewd manipulator. The fact is, the myth of his divinity was a powerful tool that he used to his advantage. The legacy of Alexander was immense. When he died, his empire was split among his generals, and one of them, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty was born, a Greek dynasty that would rule an ancient land for 3 centuries. Cleopatra was the last of that line, the final link to a man who had changed the world forever. She was a ruler who was born into the aftermath of his conquests. A world that was a mix of Greek and Egyptian culture, a world that was both a testament to his genius and a symptom of his hubris. Her story, in many ways, is a direct result of his. The air on the riverbank feels full of the cool, life-giving touch of the water. You've just learned about the legacy of Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic world. Now, we must talk about the most important part of Cleopatra's kingdom, a source of its wealth and a symbol of its power, the Nile River. This was not just a river, it was the lifeblood of Egypt, and its annual flood was a natural wonder that made the entire kingdom possible. The mainstream historical fact is that the Nile's annual flood, or inundation, was the single most important event in the Egyptian calendar. Every year, from June to September, the river would rise and flood the surrounding lands, depositing a thick layer of fertile silt. This made the land incredibly rich and productive, a natural phenomenon that turned a desert into a breadbasket. You can picture it in your mind, the brown, muddy water, the rich silt, and the lush green fields that would emerge after the floodwaters receded. This was the source of Egypt's immense wealth, the very reason it was a prize worth fighting for. A quirky detail that highlights this is the use of nilometers, ancient structures used to measure the height of the flood. These were not just scientific instruments, they were a source of immense political power. The priests and rulers who controlled them could predict the size of the harvest and use that information to set taxes and control the population. Historians still argue whether the nilometers were an accurate scientific tool or a clever piece of political control. The fact is, the ruler who controlled the Nile controlled Egypt. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, understood this perfectly. She knew that her power rested on her ability to control the flow of grain and the wealth it generated. She used this wealth to fund her ambitions, to pay for Antony's army, and to live a life of unimaginable luxury. She was a ruler who understood that her power came not from her armies or her charm, but from the life-giving waters of the Nile. The Nile was a source of both power and vulnerability. A bad flood could lead to famine and revolt, and a good flood could lead to prosperity and peace. It was a river that dictated the fate of an entire kingdom, and it was a river that Cleopatra, the last of her line, had to master if she was to survive. The air on the riverbank feels full of the sharp, medicinal scents of herbs and the quiet wisdom of ancient healers. You've just learned about the life-giving power of the Nile. Now, let's talk about another fascinating part of Cleopatra's world, ancient Egyptian medicine. This wasn't a world of magic and superstition. It was a world of surprising scientific knowledge, one that would have been a source of immense power and a reflection of the intellectual heart of her kingdom. The mainstream historical fact is that ancient Egyptian doctors were incredibly skilled, especially in the fields of surgery and pharmacology. They had a deep knowledge of anatomy and had developed a wide range of surgical instruments and techniques. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and even perform complex operations like trephining, a procedure where a hole is drilled into the skull to relieve pressure. This was a level of medical sophistication that was far beyond what was available in many other parts of the ancient world. You can almost feel the steady hand of a surgeon, the careful use of a bronze scalpel, and the quiet concentration of a doctor at work. A quirky detail that highlights their medical knowledge is the use of moldy bread to treat infections. This sounds bizarre, but it's a surprising precursor to modern antibiotics. The Egyptians had discovered that the mold on bread had an antibacterial property, and they used it to treat wounds and infections. This was a kind of proto-penicillin, a brilliant and a surprisingly effective piece of folk medicine. Historians still argue whether this was a true scientific discovery or a lucky accident. The fact is, they were able to treat infections in a way that was far more effective than their contemporaries. Cleopatra, with her love of science and knowledge, would have been deeply interested in this. She was a woman who had a library of perfume recipes and a love for a scientific approach to life. She would have seen the power of this knowledge, and she would have used it to her full advantage. A healthy army is a powerful army, and a healthy population is a productive population. Her kingdom, with its long tradition of medical knowledge, would have been a source of immense power. The story of ancient Egyptian medicine is a testament to the power of observation and a reminder that science is not a modern invention. It was a part of the world that Cleopatra inhabited, a world of both ancient traditions and surprising scientific knowledge. And in the end, it was a part of her legacy, a testament to a culture that was both a world power and a source of immense wisdom. The air on the riverbank feels full of the cold, quiet stillness of a tomb. You've just learned about the surprising sophistication of ancient Egyptian medicine. Now, we must confront one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of all time, the lost tomb of Cleopatra. This isn't just a story about a missing grave, it's a story about a queen who, even in death, refused to be found. A final act of defiance against a world that had tried to control her. The mainstream historical fact is that the exact location of Cleopatra's tomb has been lost for over 2,000 years. We know that she and Antony were buried together, as Octavian had them interred in a shared tomb after their deaths. But the location of that tomb has been a mystery, a historical holy grail that archaeologists have been searching for centuries. You can imagine the thousands of people who have walked over her final resting place without even knowing it, a silent, lost history waiting to be uncovered. A quirky detail that highlights this is the ongoing search for her tomb. For the last 2 decades, a team of archaeologists led by Dr. Kathleen Martinez has been excavating the ancient temple of Taposiris Magna, a place that she believes is the final resting place of Cleopatra and Antony. The temple, located a few miles from Alexandria, is a huge and complex site, and the team has made some stunning discoveries, including a large cemetery and a series of underground tunnels. Historians still argue whether this is the right location, but Martinez's passion and dedication are a testament to the enduring mystery of her tomb. The search for the tomb is not just about finding a body, it's about finding a final piece of a puzzle that has been missing for centuries. It's about finding the truth, a truth that has been buried under layers of myth, propaganda, and rumor. The tomb would be a place where we could finally separate fact from fiction. A place where we could finally lay to rest the ghosts of her story. The lost tomb of Cleopatra is a perfect metaphor for her life. She was a woman who was a mystery. A woman who was always one step ahead of her enemies, and even in death. She remains a step ahead, a final act of defiance against a world that had tried to control her. Her tomb, if it is ever found, would be more than just a grave. It would be a monument to a queen who, even in death, remains a legend. The air on the riverbank feels full of the scent of dust and ancient rituals. You've just learned about the mysterious search for Cleopatra's lost tomb. Now, let's talk about one of the quirkiest and most bizarre parts of ancient Egyptian life, the strange tale of the crocodile mummies. This wasn't just a random act of embalming, it was a deeply religious and spiritual practice, a testament to the Egyptians' love for their gods and their reverence for the animal world. The mainstream historical fact is that ancient Egyptians mummified animals, not just for food for the afterlife, but as a way of honoring their gods. They mummified everything from cats and dogs to ibises and baboons. But the most bizarre and intriguing of these were the crocodiles. The crocodile was the sacred animal of the god Sobek, a powerful and ancient deity who was the god of fertility, creation, and the Nile River. You can almost feel the cool, sandy air of a temple as you picture a priest, carefully wrapping a mummified crocodile in linen and placing it in a sarcophagus. It was a strange and a deeply spiritual act, a way of honoring a god who was both a source of life and a source of fear. A quirky detail that highlights this is the sheer number of mummified crocodiles that have been found. Archaeologists have discovered entire cemeteries filled with crocodile mummies, a testament to the popularity of the cult of Sobek. Some of these mummies were just a few feet long, while others were massive, some as long as 15 feet. Historians still argue whether the mummified crocodiles were wild animals that had been caught and killed for the ritual, or if they were domesticated animals that had been raised for the purpose. The fact is, the cult of Sobek was a major part of ancient Egyptian religion, and the crocodile mummies were a physical manifestation of that belief. Cleopatra, with her love for Egyptian culture and her portrayal of herself as a goddess, would have been deeply involved in these rituals. She would have seen the power of the crocodile, a creature that was a master of the land and the water, and she would have understood its symbolic importance. She would have seen the priests, the rituals, and the thousands of mummified crocodiles, all a part of the world that she ruled. The crocodile mummies are a strange and a beautiful reminder that the ancient world was a place of both immense power and deep spiritual belief. The air on the riverbank feels full of the cold, calculating ambition of a man you have yet to truly meet. You've just learned about the bizarre world of crocodile mummies. Now, we must rewind and talk about the man who would become Cleopatra's final enemy. The man who would end her dynasty and become Rome's first emperor, Octavian. His rise to power was not a story of military prowess or great romance. It was a story of cunning, ruthless pragmatism, and a political genius that was a match for Cleopatra's own. The mainstream historical fact is that Octavian was Julius Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, and his principal heir. He was just a teenager when Caesar was assassinated, a young man who was seen by many as a weak and insignificant player in the chaotic world of Roman politics. But he was a man who understood the game better than anyone. He was a master of public relations, a man who could turn public opinion to his advantage with a single speech or a cleverly worded pamphlet. You can almost feel the quiet, simmering rage that must have been burning inside him. A young man who was determined to avenge his father and take his place on the world stage. A quirky detail that highlights his cunning is his use of his last name. He was born Gaius Octavius, but after his adoption, he began to refer to himself as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or simply Caesar. This was a brilliant piece of branding, a way of associating himself with the most famous name in the Roman world. He was, in essence, a living ghost of Caesar, a man who could command the loyalty of Caesar's veterans and the Roman public. Historians still argue whether Octavian's rise was a matter of sheer luck or a testament to his political genius. The fact is, he was a master of manipulation, a man who could turn a weakness into a strength and a threat into an opportunity. While Antony was off in the east, living a life of luxury with Cleopatra, Octavian was in Rome, consolidating his power. He was not a man of great military talent, but he was a master of political maneuvering. He used his wealth and his influence to build a loyal power base, and he used propaganda to turn the Roman public against his rival. He painted Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman identity for a foreign queen, a man who had gone native in the decadent East. This was a lie, but it was a powerful one, and it was a lie that would eventually lead to Antony's downfall. Octavian was the opposite of Antony, He was a man of discipline and control, a man who understood that power in Rome was not about military might or personal charm. It was about political power, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. He was a man who had no use for romance or passion. He had only one goal: to become the sole ruler of the Roman world, and in the end, he would succeed. The air on the riverbank feels full of the cutting words of propaganda. You've just learned about Octavian's rise to power, a man who understood that a war could be won not just on the battlefield, but in the court of public opinion. Now, let's talk about his most powerful weapon, his propaganda war against Cleopatra. This wasn't just a series of nasty rumors, it was a sophisticated, relentless campaign to turn Rome against her and Mark Antony. The mainstream historical fact is that Octavian used every tool at his disposal to paint Cleopatra as a dangerous, foreign monster who had enslaved a noble Roman general. He couldn't simply say that Antony was a rival for power. He had to turn him into a victim. He had to make the Roman public believe that Antony was a good Roman at heart, but had been bewitched and corrupted by an evil foreign queen. You can almost feel the poison of his words. A carefully crafted narrative that was designed to tap into the deepest fears and prejudices of the Roman people. A quirky detail that highlights this is the rumor that Cleopatra had used a spell to castrate Antony. This was a bizarre and utterly baseless lie, but it was a powerful one. It was a way of saying that Antony was no longer a man, that he had been emasculated by a foreign woman. It was a lie that was designed to humiliate Antony and turn him into a laughingstock. Historians still argue whether Octavian truly believed the lies he was telling or if he was a cynical manipulator who knew exactly how to play on the public's fears. The fact is, he was a master of his craft, a man who could turn a rumor into a weapon of war. Octavian's propaganda was relentless. He accused Cleopatra of having a secret desire to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria and of wanting to be the queen of the Roman world. He painted her as a woman who was not just a threat to Rome's power, but a threat to Rome's very identity. She was a symbol of all that was foreign and decadent, a woman who represented a world that was the opposite of everything that Rome stood for. And in the end, it was this propaganda that won him the war. The Roman people, already wary of a long civil war, were more willing to fight against a foreign queen than a fellow Roman. Octavian gave them a clear villain, and they were happy to follow him. The air on the riverbank feels full of the scent of expensive oils and the rustle of fine linen. You've just learned how Roman propaganda turned Cleopatra into a monster. Now, let's talk about a more personal part of her story, a part that was central to her identity and her image, her influence on fashion and beauty standards. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about power, divinity, and a clever use of personal branding. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra was a fashion icon. She was a ruler who understood that what you wore and how you presented yourself was a political statement. She blended Roman, Greek, and Egyptian styles to create a look that was unique and powerful. You can imagine her in her palace, dressed in a mix of flowing Greek robes, Egyptian linen, and Roman silks, a living embodiment of the cultural mix that was her kingdom. She was a woman who could be a Greek queen one day and an Egyptian pharaoh the next, all with the change of an outfit. A quirky detail that highlights her love of beauty is her use of a makeup that was a little different than the one we know. The black coal that we often associate with her was more than just a cosmetic. It was a symbol of her status and her wealth. It was made of galena, a lead sulfide that was ground into a fine powder and then mixed with oil or water. But what about the other colours? The green malachite that we mentioned earlier was a common eyeshadow, but she also used red ochre for her lips and cheeks. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about using the colours of the earth and the gods to connect herself to a deeper, more ancient power. Historians still argue about the exact colour of her eyes and her hair, a fun debate that is a testament to the lack of clear, contemporary sources. Cleopatra also understood the importance of a well-maintained body. She was a lover of baths and used a wide range of exotic oils and perfumes to keep her skin soft and supple. She was reportedly a fan of an exfoliant made from honey and crushed alabaster, a luxury that would have been a sign of immense wealth. Her obsession with beauty was not a sign of vanity, it was a sign of her power. A queen who could afford the finest cosmetics and perfumes was a queen who had immense wealth and power. In the end, Cleopatra's influence on fashion and beauty was a reflection of her unique status as a ruler. She was a woman who was a bridge between three cultures: Greek, Roman, and Egyptian. And she used her fashion as a way of telling a story about herself. A story about a queen who was both a powerful ruler and a living goddess. The air on the riverbank feels full of the quiet hum of scribes and the rustle of papyrus scrolls. You've just learned about Cleopatra's influence on fashion and beauty. Now, let's talk about a different kind of knowledge. One that was just as important as the Great Library, but often overlooked: the Egyptian House of Life libraries. These weren't just dusty old buildings. They were a place of immense spiritual and intellectual power, a quiet counterpoint to the more famous Hellenistic institutions. The mainstream historical fact is that the houses of life were institutions attached to temples where scribes and priests studied and preserved religious and scientific texts. They were a place of learning, but their focus was different from the Great Library. While the library was a secular institution dedicated to all known knowledge, the houses of life were a place of spiritual learning, a place where the ancient traditions of Egypt were kept alive. You can imagine a young scribe, carefully copying an ancient text, a living connection to a tradition that was thousands of years old. A quirky detail that highlights their importance is their role in ancient Egyptian medicine. Remember that we talked about the surprising sophistication of ancient Egyptian medicine. Well, much of that knowledge was preserved and passed down in the houses of life. These were the places where doctors were trained and where medical texts were stored. The priests who worked there were not just religious figures, they were also doctors, astronomers, and scientists. Historians still argue whether the knowledge in the houses of life was a source of new discovery or just a way of preserving old traditions. The fact is, they were a vital part of the Egyptian intellectual world, a quiet and powerful force that kept the ancient traditions alive. Cleopatra, with her love of Egyptian culture and her portrayal of herself as a goddess, would have been deeply connected to these institutions. She would have seen them as a source of legitimacy and a way of connecting herself to the ancient traditions of her land. They were a source of immense power, a quiet and powerful force that was a match for any Roman institution. The houses of life are a reminder that the world that Cleopatra ruled was not just a world of politics and war, it was a world of deep spiritual and intellectual traditions, a world that was a match for any Roman. The air on the riverbank feels full of the strangeness of ancient custom. You've just learned about the houses of life. Now, let's talk about a bizarre and often misunderstood part of Cleopatra's dynasty, the tradition of sibling marriage. This wasn't some strange, depraved custom. It was a deeply ingrained political practice that was meant to keep power and wealth within the family. The mainstream historical fact is that the Ptolemaic dynasty, for much of its existence, practiced incestuous sibling marriage. Cleopatra herself was married to two of her younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. This wasn't a love match, it was a political arrangement, a way of keeping the royal bloodline pure and ensuring that power didn't fall into the hands of a rival. You can almost feel the uncomfortable tension of a forced marriage between two siblings who were also political rivals. A quirky detail that highlights this is the origin of the practice. It was not a Greek tradition, it was an ancient Egyptian one, a tradition that dated back to the pharaohs who believed they were descended from the gods. Sibling marriage was a way of imitating the gods, who were believed to have married their own siblings, the Ptolemies, in a clever move to legitimize their rule in the eyes of their Egyptian subjects, adopted this tradition. Historians still argue whether this was a true embrace of Egyptian culture or a cynical political ploy. The fact is, it was a practice that led to a lot of genetic problems and a lot of political instability. The Ptolemaic family tree is a tangled mess of sibling marriages, and it's a testament to the fact that their dynasty was more a family of rivals than a family of allies. They were constantly fighting for power, and their marriages were a part of that fight. It was a world of intrigue and betrayal, a world where your sibling was not just your spouse but also your greatest enemy. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, knew how to play this game. She used her marriages to her advantage, and she was not afraid to use her power to eliminate a rival, even if that rival was her own brother. The tradition of sibling marriage is a strange and a powerful reminder that the ancient world was a place of different values and different customs. It was a world where a queen could marry her brother and be seen as a legitimate ruler, a world that was both a lot like ours and completely, utterly different. The air on the riverbank feels full of the heavy sighs of a man in decline. You've just learned about the bizarre tradition of sibling marriage in Cleopatra's dynasty. Now, let's talk about a man who, like her, was a product of his time but was also a victim of his own choices. Mark Antony, his later life and his decisions, particularly his public relationship with Cleopatra, were a direct path to his downfall. A tragic story of a man who had everything and lost it all. The mainstream historical fact is that Mark Antony, for much of his life, was a powerful and respected Roman general. He was a man who had fought alongside Caesar, who had avenged his death, and who had a powerful, apolitical base in Rome. But after he met Cleopatra, his life took a dramatic turn. He became more and more focused on the East, and he began to adopt a lifestyle that was seen as decadent and un-Roman by his countrymen. This wasn't just a personal choice, it was a political one, and it was a choice that would be used against him by his rival, Octavian. A quirky detail that highlights this is his love for Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and revelry. Antony, in a move that was seen as deeply un-Roman, began to portray himself as the living embodiment of the god. He held lavish feasts, he drank heavily, and he lived a life of excess that was a stark contrast to the frugal and disciplined lifestyle of Octavian. This was a move that was designed to appeal to the Greek and Egyptian public, but it was a move that alienated him from his Roman allies. Historians still argue whether Antony's love for the East was a genuine embrace of a new culture or a sign of his psychological decline. The fact is, he was a man who was torn between two worlds, and in the end, he would lose both. Antony's decisions were a series of blunders that were both personal and political. He divorced his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's sister, a public humiliation that was a declaration of war. He gave away vast swathes of Roman territory to Cleopatra and her children, an act that was seen as a betrayal of the Roman people, and he allowed himself to be seen as a man who was a slave to a foreign queen, a powerful piece of propaganda that would be used against him by Octavian. In the end, Antony was a tragic figure. He was a man who was both a hero and a fool, a man who had a chance to rule the world but lost it all for a woman. His love for Cleopatra was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, and it was a love that would lead him to his doom. The air on the riverbank feels full of the scent of incense and the quiet hum of a prayer. You've just learned about Antony's tragic decline. Now, let's talk about a more spiritual part of Cleopatra's life, her association with the cult of Isis. This wasn't just a personal devotion, it was a clever and powerful political move, one that strengthened her rule and gave her a divine connection to her people. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra was closely associated with the goddess Isis, and she actively promoted her worship. Isis was a powerful and beloved Egyptian goddess, a deity of fertility, motherhood, and magic. By portraying herself as the new Isis, Cleopatra was able to command the loyalty and devotion of her Egyptian subjects. You can imagine her in her palace, dressed in the traditional garb of the goddess, a living connection to a tradition that was thousands of years old. This was not just a religious act, it was a political statement. A quirky detail that highlights this is her appearance at her famous meeting with Mark Antony in Tarsus. Remember how she dressed as Venus, the Roman goddess? Well, to her Egyptian subjects, she was Isis. She was a ruler who could be a different goddess to different people, a master of a different kind of diplomacy. She was Venus to the Romans, a goddess of love and beauty, and she was Isis to the Egyptians, a goddess of power and life. This was a clever and powerful piece of political theatre, a way of speaking to different audiences in their own language. Historians still argue whether her devotion to Isis was a genuine love for the goddess or a cynical political ploy. The fact is, she was a ruler who understood that power in Egypt was not just about military might, it was about divine right. The cult of Isis was not just a local phenomenon, it was a cult that was spreading throughout the Mediterranean, a religion that was becoming more and more popular in the Roman world. By associating herself with the goddess, Cleopatra was not just strengthening her position in Egypt, she was also building a power base in the Roman world. She was a ruler who was both a local and a global figure, a woman who understood that her power came from a mix of both. In the end, Cleopatra's association with Isis was a testament to her intelligence, She was a ruler who understood that she couldn't simply rely on her Roman allies. She had to build her own power base. And she did that by embracing the very culture her ancestors had ignored. She was a woman who could be a goddess, a queen, and a powerful ruler all at once. The air on the riverbank feels heavy with the cold, hard stone of a mausoleum. You've just learned about Cleopatra's association with Isis. Now, we'll witness the final standoff, the dramatic and somber moments leading up to her death, locked away in her tomb with her most trusted handmaidens. This wasn't a time of grand speeches or bold acts. It was a quiet, desperate, and utterly theatrical end for a queen who had always lived her life as a performance. The mainstream historical fact is that after Mark Antony's death, Cleopatra retreated to the mausoleum she had built. She was not alone. She had her two most loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, with her. The mausoleum was a two-story structure, a place of immense wealth, filled with all the treasures of her dynasty. You can imagine the scene. The queen, her face a mask of grief and determination, surrounded by her wealth but with her world crumbling around her. She was a ruler who was now a prisoner, and her tomb was her final throne. A quirky detail that highlights her state of mind is the report that she tried to negotiate with Octavian. She sent him messages, trying to bargain for her life and the lives of her children. But Octavian, a man who had no use for mercy, gave her no quarter. He wanted her alive, but he would not give her any promises. He sent his agents to her, not to negotiate, but to deceive her. He wanted her to believe that she had a chance, a hope that would keep her from taking her own life. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra was truly trying to negotiate or if she was just buying time. Was she a queen who was desperate to live, or was she a queen who was just preparing for her final act? The final standoff was a battle of wills. Cleopatra, a woman who had always been a master of manipulation, was now facing a man who was a match for her. Octavian was not a man who was swayed by charm or beauty. He was a man who was only swayed by power, and he had all of it. He had her surrounded, and he had her trapped. She knew that her time was running out, and she had to act quickly. Her final act was a testament to her unbreakable will. She would not be a Roman trophy, she would die a queen. The air on the riverbank feels full of the cold, clean order of a new ruler. You've just witnessed the dramatic final standoff and Cleopatra's refusal to be captured. Now, we'll explore the immediate aftermath of her death, a period that saw the end of an ancient dynasty and the beginning of a new Roman Empire. Her death was not just the end of a life, it was the end of a world. The mainstream historical fact is that with the death of Cleopatra, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to a final but brutal end. Octavian, ever the pragmatist, wasted no time in consolidating his power. He had her son, Caesarion, executed, citing the famous line, "It is not good to have too many Caesars." The last male heir to both Julius Caesar and the Ptolemaic throne was gone, a final and brutal act that ensured Octavian's sole rule. You can almost feel the chill that must have shot through the Roman world, a clear and undeniable sign that a new, more ruthless ruler was in charge. A quirky detail that highlights Octavian's cunning is how he treated Cleopatra's other children. He spared the lives of her 3 children with Antony, a rare act of mercy that was likely a politically motivated one. By raising them in his household, he could control them and use them as a symbol of his victory. This was a man who understood that a show of mercy could be just as powerful as a show of force. Historians still argue whether Octavian's mercy was a genuine act of compassion or a cynical political ploy. The fact is, he was a man who was a master of his own public image, and he was not afraid to use his power to get what he wanted. The immediate aftermath of her death was also the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. Octavian, with no rivals left, returned to Rome and, in 27 BC, was given the title of Augustus, or the Revered One. He was Rome's first emperor, the man who would turn a republic into an empire. The war against Cleopatra and Antony, once a civil war, was now a war of conquest. The Roman people, tired of years of civil war, were more than happy to accept a strongman who could provide them with peace and stability. The world that Cleopatra had fought so hard to save was gone, replaced by a new, more powerful, and more dangerous one. Her death was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a moment that allowed a new ruler to rise. a new empire to be born, and a new world to begin. She was the last of her kind, a queen who had fought a world that was too big for her, and in the end, she lost. But her story, a story of a queen who dared to challenge Rome, would live on for millennia. The air on the riverbank feels full of the weight of history, the quiet hum of a story that has been told and retold for millennia. You've just witnessed the brutal aftermath of Cleopatra's death. Now, we'll reflect on her enduring legend, a story that has been shaped and reshaped by poets, playwrights, and filmmakers for centuries. Her life was a grand performance, and in the end, her death was just the beginning of her real story. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra's legend has been told and retold by her enemies and her admirers. The Romans, in their propaganda, painted her as a dangerous, seductive monster, a figure that was both hated and feared. But in later centuries, she was remade into a different kind of figure, a tragic heroine who had fought a losing battle against a ruthless empire. Shakespeare, in his play Antony and Cleopatra, turned her into a woman of immense passion and tragedy, a queen who would rather die than be humiliated. And Hollywood, in films like the 1963 epic starring Elizabeth Taylor, turned her into a symbol of beauty, glamour, and power. A quirky detail that highlights this is the number of artists and writers who have been inspired by her story. She has been the subject of countless plays, poems, and novels, a figure who has captured the imagination of everyone from Dante to George Bernard Shaw. This is a testament to the power of her story, a story that is both a tragedy and a triumph. She was a woman who was a ruler, a lover, and a mother, a woman who lived her life on an epic scale. And her story has been a source of inspiration for a very, very long time. Historians still argue whether the real Cleopatra will ever be known. The propaganda of her Roman enemies and the romanticism of her later admirers have made it difficult to separate fact from fiction. But in a way, that's what makes her so fascinating. She is a figure who exists in the space between history and myth, a woman who is both a symbol of power and a victim of it. She is a queen who, even in death, remains a legend, a final testament to the power of a woman who dared to challenge Rome itself. And so, we come to the end of our journey, a journey that has taken us from the humid air of the Nile Delta to the cold, hard stone of a mausoleum. You can feel the soft breeze on your skin, a whisper from a world that is long gone. The sounds of the ancient city fade into the night, the ghosts of queens and generals, of love and betrayal, all fading into the silence. You can close your eyes now and let the sounds and scents of the past fade away, leaving you with nothing but the quiet hum of your own thoughts. There is no more history to remember, no more battles to be won. There is only the quiet comfort of your own bed and the peaceful silence of the night. So, let's ease into sleep, shall we? You can let go of the past and just drift. Just let yourself be carried away by the soft current of your dreams. The stars are out now, a quiet, peaceful glow in the darkness. You can just let go. End of script. Sweet dreams.